Good day, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Antonio Karlović. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Zagreb. I'm studying with the contestation of EU foreign policy, and it's my great pleasure to chair this panel, which will basically explore how the EU and other actors are influencing the Balkans right now. Before we begin, I think I have to mention that this session will be recorded, and I hope it will be available for people who could not catch us today because they're viewing another panel or just have something else in life going on. And the first thing I just want to mention as an intro is, why are the Balkans so important? Well, geopolitically, they are important because they are strategically placed. They serve as some kind of a passageway between the East and the West. And some classic geopolitical writers have suggested that it was crucial for European nations to conquer the Balkans because they could, by doing this, achieve invincibility. Historically, the Balkans are important because arguably no other region has caused so much grief to so many foreign empires, especially in the 20th century. But why are the Balkans so important for the EU? I would say, first of all, because they have an symbolical importance. The EU is fundamentally a peace project, and the Balkans were the site of the last great European war. More recently, the Balkans were the site of the most prominent refugee route during the 2015 refugee crisis. And finally, the Balkans are the regions that hosts or contains almost all potential EU member states. If you count in Turkey, then it's all, because there's a part of it on the Balkans. And therefore, we can say that in a way, the Balkans are EU's past, present, and future. What we'll talk about today are basically 4 excellent papers which examine various aspects of the topic, and we will have a lively discussion afterwards with hopefully a lot of questions from the audience. We will begin with a paper that will surely provoke much needed introspection on the process of European integration, which can and arguably has served as a process that bolsters illiberalism in the Balkans. To demonstrate this point, the first paper, will look at the case of Serbia's process of Europeanization, which did not turn out very favorable. After that, we'll have another paper, which will focus again on Serbia's journey towards EU membership, but this time from a completely different perspective, or not completely different, but with a different emphasis, which this paper will stress the issue of Kosovo. The third paper will, on the other hand, examine how other actors, namely Turkey, react to EU's progress or the lack of progress in promoting its values and institutions in the region, or integration in general. And finally, we will have a look into the future with a paper that explores how the EU's enlargement strategy for the Balkans can be rejuvenated. But enough from me. I would please ask our first presenter, Anthony Horne from the University of Portsmouth, to take the stage and present his, as I have already mentioned, thought-provoking research. So I don't know if I have to, or he can just take the lead.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good morning to you all. It's an absolute pleasure to present here. I'll try and keep my presentation as brief as possible. As you probably gathered from my paper, brevity and conciseness is not my strong point. Right, so everyone. So my name is Tony Horne. I'm based at the University of Portsmouth, and the purpose of today's paper is to explore the duplicity of the EU's normative Europeanization by taking the case study of Serbia's protracted pathway towards EU membership. So before I establish my theoretical kind of re-engagement with Bösel and Risser's well-known framework on Europeanization as norm diffusion, I want to just address some of the ways in which Europeanization has been addressed within the prevailing strands of the literature. So first of all, I take the general working definition of Europeanization as any kind of European dimension, which becomes an embedded feature, molding the content and form of domestic and foreign policies of the European states. And of course, this seems like a relatively, I mean, coming from the perspective as of a more kind of critical and constructivist lens, this definition does speak to me. However, prevailing trends in kind of what I kind of understood as somewhat of a kind of early wave of Europeanization scholarship tended towards the theoretical limitations of neo-functionalism and liberal intergovernmentalism, which primarily emphasize on more case study approaches in specific sectors such as education or various sectors of the economy, whereby member states either download, if you will, various EU paradigms such as laws, directives, regulations, or they upload and they influence the process. Well, this understanding of Europeanization is interesting because it kind of has a somewhat bi-directional process between and the kind of explore the kind of interplay between the member states and the EU itself. It's still quite a rigid understanding, which for purposes of avoiding conceptual overstretch tends to avoid engaging in the more historic and national contingent and ideational perspectives on Europeanization. However, the waves of European enlargement into the former communist bloc, as well as taking the broader earlier waves of and attempts of enlargement whereby the EU faced authoritarian regimes such as the fascist and military dictatorships in Spain and Portugal, for instance, the EU's democratic identity very much came into the fold. And with the Big Bang enlargement, this really cemented an idea of Europeanization as fundamentally driven by democratic transformation. And of course, this led to a kind of geospatial normative reconfiguration both within Europe and also beyond, when you look at the European neighbourhood policy and the EU's relations towards the Middle East and North Africa, or towards the Eastern Partnership with Russia and the post-Soviet states. However, there has been a lot of criticism lately, obviously, as the literature has moved into the 2010s with the rise of crises. De-Europeanization has increasingly kind of come into play as somewhat of a paradigm shift, where you've got rising Euroscepticism, various processes such as the rise of illiberalism within the Central Eastern European countries, namely the Visegrad 4 group, being led by Orban and Poland and their broader illiberal crusade, as well as the EU's significant normative challenges coming from processes such as Brexit or Putin's Russia, or indeed the rise of authoritarianism under Erdogan. However, what this Europeanization process, while very instructive and important, it tends to kind of overlook or maybe downplay certain more pathological elements of Europeanization. Just because I'm sorry I don't have to go into this, but I do recommend Martin Mendelski's work on the impacts of neoliberal and free market reforms in creating unintended consequences for broader EU reform areas in the post-Big Bang enlargement countries. And it also kind of overlooks that enlargement, that Europeanization can sometimes be incomplete or selective. So this brings me to the guiding research question of the extent to which the EU's enlargement agenda may undermine its broader processes of liberal normative Europeanization in the Western Balkans. So this research departed from an understanding of Europeanization as norm diffusion, which differed from prevailing approaches such as Shimon Fenig and Sedlmeyer's external incentives model, which focused on a more kind of unidirectional process and kind of arguably on the kind of relationship, kind of overlooked some of the more deleterious aspects of this kind of EU and non-EU partner hegemony. So what was interesting about the norm diffusion model was that it did allow for some scope between the EU and the Europeanizing state or actor. And while it did focus on more obvious methods of direct EU influence into the partners, i.e. through coercive or legal measures or processes of investing funds into generating capacity building in key reform areas. It also kind of allowed for a more kind of normative understanding and ideational process through increased mobility programs such as the Erasmus or Erasmus Plus, and creating the impetus for broader regional solidarity was a key factor in creating socialization and a way of getting Europeanization to hit home. And what was interesting about the model was the date in which it came out. It's one of the things which kind of which sustains the explanatory power of the model was the scope conditions, namely that you use the model still does have a relative degree of power, but it very much is contingent on issues of recognized or unrecognized statehood, or the nature of the regime, or the degrees of power imbalance between the EU and the other partners. My approach took a slightly different route. I saw significant added value in the theoretical insights of multi-level governance, primarily because this tends to kind of redirect away from Europeanization as driven kind of solely by the EU, and the right to an understanding about Europeanization as a very kind of fluid concept, kind of stretching very historical and nationally contingent concept, which kind of saw a kind of convergence of multiple different narratives, both national and also within intra-national as well, and this kind of convergence of kind of shared understandings of what European values could be. Indeed, Flockhart and Mike Mann obviously rightly mentioned that fascism, communism, and the Western colonialism also have European dimensions as well. So this kind of multi-level governance approach, which kind of focuses on the kind of different levels at which Europeanization is spread, kind of, and also brings into mind the normative work by on Bob, who kind of explore how established processes of norm convergence or liberal norm convergence can very easily be hijacked by bad faith actors. So my reconstruction of the mechanisms kind of explored how coercion can in turn bring about a kind of sense of re-entrenchment, or kind of doubling down on anti-EU and nationalist rhetoric as a way of kind of retrieving a form of political legitimacy and kind of playing into often mediatized nationalist rhetoric. Liberal cross-loading was also kind of identified as a potential counter-normative mechanism, which kind of mirrors the Berzon and Risser's socialization, which explores the ways in which counter-normative and bad faith actors can form networks and thus mobilize resources to generate these counter-narratives. And of course, this also gives rise to a kind of strategic reframing of Europe, whereby illiberal states can articulate an exclusionary and ethnocentric or more homogenous understanding of Europe. And then, of course, this gave rise to the EU's complicity in this, or I'd probably more say its complacency. Indeed, the manipulation of utility conditions is also kind of referred to as Domorodski as a kind of opportunistic legitimization. The EU kind of hinges the legitimacy of its rules based on the ability for it to find willing reform partners who, whilst amenable at the Brussels level, can still be quite contentious figures domestically. Then, of course, it also focused on the ways in which this kind of leads to this Potemkin compliance, or kind of instance whereby the partner state can have kind of insincere motivations for both functional and normative Europeanization. And then, of course, the state-centric particularism kind of also problematizes the tendency of the EU to kind of foster the kind of regatta principle. Anyway, so this study took a mixed methods explanatory sequential approach. In the quantitative phase, it did two things. First of all, it collected the EU's annual progress reports with Serbia, including, and in the time frame of study, it also included the early stabilization and association agreement reports. It excluded Montenegro from the analysis, although its progress was still kind of relevant in the kind of early until the reports in 2006. This was important to see kind of how Serbia's compliance and democratization kind of progressed over time. This was done. I'll elaborate a little bit more on the coding more in the Q&A session. This was plotted against the VDEM Liberal Democracy Index, and this provided a kind of guide and direction for the study of the qualitative analysis, which was primarily taken from 20 speeches from a range of different actors in the Serbian politicians and presidents, as well as key EU officials, and also kind of analysed the speech and discourse from far-right groups, both within Serbia and also within the EU, and also transnationally as well. This was to kind of provide a kind of substance, or kind of way of texturing the Serbia's EU trajectory. As I'm very conscious of time, I will not go into the Serbia's context, and I will just go straight into the findings. So obviously, in order to identify this trajectory of duplicitous Europeanization, the study drew from the works of Bernelt and Freiburg and Richter and Wunsch, who used who used pretty much the same kind of coding scale for the analysis of progress reports in the candidate countries. So this research mainly kind of built on that, but obviously I do have a lot of things to say about coding, which unfortunately will not be included for time. But what this revealed was, alongside its democratic progress, the initial identified essentially two phases, which is very much punctuated by the SAA and the official enlargement period in 2012, whereby Serbia's EU candidacy is officiated. During the SAA period, there was obviously a significant period of volatility, not only with the independence of Kosovo, which significantly problematized Serbia's relations with the EU and indeed its compliance, particularly during the uneasy coalition of Vojislav Kostunica and Boris Tadic, Kostunici's subsequent departure from the government. But it was also the financial crisis and broader issues of systemic corruption, which hindered Serbia from being able to allocate resources in crucial reform areas. Having said that, it wasn't until the Vučić and Nikolić period to the present, whereby the standards of liberal democracy, namely plural competition, freedom of press, and independence of judiciary, really began to drastically deteriorate, despite a gradual, if inconsistent, progress. So In exploring the counter mechanisms of oppositional Europeanization, namely the re-entrenchment and the cross-loading, the illiberal cross-loading and the ideational reframing of Europe's values, I've found that in the discourse analysis, there has been significant porosity between mainstream.
Sorry to interrupt, but please just speed up because we've crossed time. So take another minute or two and bring to an end.
I do apologize for that. From my findings, I've found that there have been, as I said, there's been significant porosity between various sections of the radical right and the mainstream ruling governments within Serbia. But there's also been a very worrying complacency and indeed at times complicity from the EU itself. And while the progress reports have indeed showcased key areas of Serbia's deviation, the EU's strategic priorities within Serbia and the Balkans writ large, namely the reborderization and the imprisonment and detention of refugees within the Western Balkans countries, has showcased how the EU itself has kind of strategically manipulated the Western Balkans conditions of peripherality to its own advantage. And what this is particularly worrying is that it showcases that at the heart of Europeanization, there is a very worrying problem of desolidarization. Which is at the heart, which I believe is kind of at the heart of these broader problems of division. Not only has the growing normalization of far-right discourse into the mainstream, such as the recent French debates on so-called Islamo-Gauchism from within the Macron government, to the anti-immigration politics of the Danish Social Democrats, this is undoubtedly going to continue to distort the EU's relations with the Western Balkans, regardless of what ideas for reforming them.
Okay, I think that was a very nice presentation. Let's just go on further on our paper about Serbia, because the case is very, very interesting. It comes from Marija Loncarevic. I would ask her to take the screen and start. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Antonio, for being the chair, and thank you, Anthony, for this phenomenal presentation. Your research seems really interesting. Maybe we can collaborate in the future. I don't know. My research, it focuses on Serbia's journey towards the EU membership and critical examination of the EU acquis with a particular emphasis on Chapter 35 and the Brussels Agreement. So, this paper aims to critically investigate the European Union negotiation process by explicitly focusing on Chapter 35, or the so-called Other Issues chapter of the EU acquis. And we aim actually in this research to bring to the fore the extent to which Serbia's long-standing dispute with its former province Kosovo has stood as the fundamental obstacle that countries has encountered during the accession process ever since it officially submitted its accession application to the EU, right? So our original argument is that the accession process and the resolution of territorial disputes have been seamlessly interwoven in a path-dependent relation. The rationale and the research background. The EU has been actively engaged as an interlocutor in the process of normalizing diplomatic relations between Pristina and Belgrade via the so-called Brussels Agreement. We are going to look into it later on. So typically the countries waiting in line to join the bloc, they're so-called candidate countries, right? They do not have to address the other issues expounded in Chapter 35 until the very final stage of their accession negotiations. What makes things more challenging here is the fact that the explicit wording of the other issues domain, it is quite open-ended. So my paper, it aims to critically examine the path-dependent relationship binding these two distant domains. And our main argument is that the accession process and the resolution of the territorial disputes, they have been seamlessly interwoven in a path-dependent relationship, as we mentioned earlier. Section 1, it looks into constitutional changes in parallel state. It gives us a historical background of the problem between Serbia and Kosovo, right, and how it all started. So in 1968, the Executive Committee, they proposed constitutional amendments which were implemented in 3 different stages. First one was in 1969, 71, and 74. So in all 3 instances, Kosovo was given identical autonomy with all the other republics, right, of the Yugoslavia. However, the province was given the status of the republic in name only, without an option to secede. In 1989, the former president Slobodan Milošević, he abolished Kosovo's far-reaching autonomy as a Serbian province and put it under direct control of Belgrade, which marked a paradigm shift and went hand in hand with the drafting of a novel constitution. And here, this aggravated the Kosovo-Albanian political elite disgruntlement. And what happened is they degenerated for more systematic calls for a parallel state, who sought to obtain international support vis-a-vis their overreaching goal, which is succession, right? We are now moving to 1997 student demonstrations. So upon unfolding of the disintegration of Yugoslavia, which were the weak point for Yugoslavia, and in October 1987, the student protest movement, they gained unprecedented momentum. By appealing to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the student demonstration, they were arguably successful in gaining the broader public allegiance, and they were able to usher a universal consensus amongst the Kosovo Albanians in favor of independence. The efforts undertaken by Western countries to impose the Kosovo Albanians and the Serbians, they were presented to Slobodan Milošević, former president. They included 5 objectives. This was perceived by Serbian side as fait accompli, and on March 24, 1999, NATO launched a strategic bombing operation against the Serbian government, and the United Nations Security Council, they failed to reach a consensus on the NATO air campaign. And that being the case, there is still an ongoing robust debate amongst the experts with regards to the legal or lack thereof, right, the basis of this intervention. A peace agreement was signed later on in Kumanovo air base in northern Macedonia in June 1999. And subsequently, the UN Security Council, they passed the resolution 1244, which marked a critical juncture for the province's future, and it became an international protectorate, though formally it was still under the sovereignty of Serbia. The Kosovo question, the role of international organizations. So in the second half of the 20th century, the international community, they took a more rigorous approach vis-a-vis self-determination. And the core precondition for a territory to obtain independence was to have the consent and approval by their parent state. De jure constitutional right to proclaim independence was never extended to 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina. And Kosovo, they unilaterally declared its independence in February 2008, and after a robust international campaign for that cause, Kosovo was officially recognized, you can see in this map, by nearly 1/3 of the countries participating in the United Nations General Assembly. Section 2, it focuses on 2 conceptualization associated with my research, which are quasi-state and parent state. So 5 factors which contribute to the viability of a quasi-state are, first one is the development of national identity, which are also doubted as a national building. Second one is the militarization of society. Third one is the weaknesses of a parent state, and in our case, Serbia, with its political and institutional as well as military capacities. Fourth one is the excessive financial support from an external patron state. And the final 5th one is the protected status of quasi-states by the international community. International law, it explicitly highlights that the recognition of a new state will be lawful and recognized by the other state, and it hinges on the consent of its parent state. So since both Kosovo and Serbia, they aim to join the EU, European Union, Brussels has urged both of them to have successfully engaged in normalizing relations, and in order to be eligible to join the bloc, and the EU has committed itself to serve as a mediator in order for two parties to resolve some of the technical issues. The first EU activity was launch of its law mission, the Eurolex. Here we're going to look now section 3. It points a specific emphasis on the carrot and stick approach, or the conditionality. So whereas at the initial stages of the EU existence, conditionality was secondary policy instrument, which was used vis-a-vis third countries. In contemporary setting, it represents the most important pillar of the European Union. The EU conditionality and its transformative power, they principally depend on the amount of the support and benefits which candidate countries expect to ensure during the accession process. During 2000, the EU signed the stabilization and accession agreements with each Western Balkan countries, and which they did not enter into effect simultaneously. Via the so-called Thessaloniki Agenda, the EU sent a very clear message to the region. They said the future of the Balkans is within the European Union, and the Copenhagen criteria, they were accompanied with a specific set of conditions. And for example, one of them is the cooperation with The Hague, which was an imperative. In January 2014, Serbia officially entered into accession negotiations with the European Commission. Section 4 engaged with the Brussels Agreement and the so-called other issues associated with the accession process enfringed in the Chapter 35 and the EU acquis. So whereas Chapter 35 is not the only pending issue which Serbia needs to forcefully address, of course, it has played a determinantal role in aggravating tension between the two sides. In the European Union, they have systematically contended that the normalization of relations between Pristina and Belgrade is a priority for their respective paths towards EU membership. And after UN Resolution 1244, the Brussels Agreement, which was signed in April 2013, it has acquired an unparalleled role as a legal document vis-a-vis the relationship between Belgrade and Pristina. The agreement, it provides a robust framework to facilitate negotiations between the two parties, and has been hailed by the international community as a historical milestone towards the normalization of relations between Serbia and Kosovo. So the story behind the dialogue, here we extrapolate the three separate phases encompassing the negotiations. First one is the technical dialogue. Second one is the high-level political dialogue, which was mediated by the High Representative Catherine Ashton. And the third one is high-level political dialogue mediated by the High Representative Federica Mogherini. Overall, the agreement spells out the following core objectives. First one is normalizing relations between Pristina and Belgrade. Second one is resolving the long-standing dispute between the two sides. And the final one is revitalizing both parties, the European integration path. Here, so it is important, we can see the framework of the process of the framework of the Brussels Agreement. But here it is important to know that until the time of writing, the full implementation has not yet been achieved, since only 4 domains have, from the 15 have been entirely enforced. The EU has categorized the pending issues into 3 different levels. First one is partial implementation. Second one is some small progress. And the third one is no progress at all. So between 2011 and 2015, the significant progress took place in the negotiations. However, once the process shifted to the implementation phase, from the technical to the implementation phase, the negotiations, they lost their momentum. And accordingly, what we argue here is that the agreement was only able to achieve a partial settlement on the most contentious issues, preventing the rapprochement between two sides. Chapter 35. The EU essentially established a robust framework, and the progress vis-à-vis enlargement directly hinges on the adequate implementation of the Brussels Agreement. The other issues chapter of the EU acquis is characterized by a path-dependent relationship to the Brussels Agreement. Accordingly, Serbia's capacity to comply with the essential components compromising the Brussels dialogue is precondition for the country to be eligible to obtain EU membership. The normalization of relations between Pristina and Belgrade within the context of the Brussels Agreement, they acted as a catalyst for Serbia to be officially considered as a candidate country. Chapter 35 of the EU acquis was opened in November 2015, and the Commission explicitly stated that the objective of the chapter, they did not aim to replace the negotiation framework that had been initiated between Belgrade and Pristina. Rather, it sought to reinforce and supplement the conditions stated in the Brussels Agreement. In this way, what the European Union did, the European Union, they cemented the link between two features, right? Making the progress on the other issues chapter conditional upon progress in the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue and the implementation of achieved agreements. Conclusion, so as a transformative power and a sui generis foreign policy actor, the EU is irrevocably committed to securing and maintaining the peace in the Western Balkans. The EU designed a robust framework which sought to accomplish two goals. First one is, in addition to advocating a sustainable rapprochement between Belgrade and Pristina via its numerous stick and carrots, the EU undertook the mediator's role to ensure that both parties, they did not backslide from their promises. The second objective of the EU is to ensure that Serbia continues to stay on track with its European perspectives, and thus by adequately conforming to the conditions of the Brussels Agreement, ipso facto the country would be able to conclude its negotiations on Chapter 35. So finally, due to the Serbia's long-standing territorial problems, the EU has shifted its attention from the essential components encompassing the accession process to the normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina. And this being the case, we argue that Serbia's European accession is directly conditioned upon the country's satisfactory commitment, and not only commitment, but also compliance with the Brussels Agreement. Thank you so much. This was all from me. Let me just...
Thank you, Maria.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, I think that this will be an interesting comparison of the cases between you and Anthony. That's how you see it. But we'll talk about it further in the Q&A. Let's go further with Jan's presentation. Jan Niemiec from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. We'll talk about Turkish influence.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so hello once again, everyone. My name is Jan Niemiec, and I am PhD candidate at the Department of National Security of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And my presentation today is a preliminary research on Turkish foreign policy towards the Western Balkans, which is related to my doctoral dissertation. And I must admit that I slightly modified the thematic scope of my paper in order to emphasize the impact of COVID pandemic on relations between Turkey and the Western Balkans. So moving on to the outline, in the first part, I will present some theoretical and methodological aspects of my research. Next, I will briefly talk about some basic assumptions of Turkish foreign policy doctrine and its implementation over the years, of course. In the following part, I will focus on Turkey's political strategy towards the Balkan states, where Turkish government attempts to create a model of cooperation alternative to the EU. And finally, I will discuss determinants of Turkey's involvement in the Western Balkans during the ongoing pandemic. And of course, to conclude, I will describe some maybe prospects for Turkish-Balkan relations in the future. So, as a theoretical basis for my research, I adopted the image theory in international relations, which is very useful in exploring a policy-making process. According to its assumptions, image theory examines foreign policy of a given state in relation to its internal and international images, which are created by decision makers. And moreover, those political perceptions are often shaped by a social sentiment and the preferences of the voters. So if politicians can properly combine individual images, those individual perceptions, into a coherent picture, their diplomatic activities might improve the international position of a state. And image theorists also suggest that images determine the general scope of activity of a given state in an international system, defining its capabilities and limitations with regard to the others. At the current stage of my research, I am still conducting a review of literature on relations between Turkey and the Western Balkans. And as a graduate of Turkology in my work, I have been employing mainly Turkish sources related to this topic, like academic publications, policy briefs, public reports, and so on. And using the research methods which are listed here in the slide, I try to answer the research question, that is, how did the COVID pandemic affect Turkey's foreign policy strategy towards the Western Balkans? Speaking of image theory, I have to mention that this theoretical approach originated from Kenneth Balding and Olavi Holsley's studies on national images. In this slide, we see researchers who made the greatest contribution to the development of this theory. And among them, I think the most prominent is Richard Herman, the author of the first typology of international images. Michel Alexander, for example, refined his approach by adding a category of social identity and by underlining relationship between perception of foreign policy and structural determinants of the international system. But in conclusions of recent studies, image theorists agree that it is necessary to further improve the theoretical model, especially in terms of developing new types of images and then including them into the Herman typology. Okay, so let's move to the next part then. As you probably know, since 2002, Turkish foreign policy remains under control of the Justice and Development Party. In Turkish, is Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, AKP. So AKP is a conservative party with Islamist roots, founded by Recep Tayyip Erdogan on the right in the picture. Initially, the AKP announced that it would continue the pro-Western foreign policy of previous governments, but soon Turkey's interest shifted more towards neighboring regions. This change was influenced by Ahmet Davutoğlu, Prime Minister Erdogan's chief advisor. According to his strategic depth conception, which was adopted by the AKP as a new doctrine of Turkish foreign policy, Turkey was to strive to become a dominant state in the region. And this is important to know that the region was understood as an area of the former Ottoman Empire. So the Middle East, North Africa, Balkans, and Caucasus. Davutoğlu proposed to implement an active and multifaceted foreign policy program to present Turkey as the state responsible for its neighborhood. In this context, the main diplomatic tool was the zero problems with neighbors tactic, which was supposed to diffuse regional tensions and disputes using all possible means like diplomacy, trade, culture, and so on. As a result, Turkey's geopolitical surroundings would have been transformed into a danger-free zone. And finally, by promoting Turkish values and political solutions, Turkey was supposed to create its image as a role model for all neighboring states. So as we can see, in the strategic depth conception, Turkey was presented as a state with a traditional Muslim identity, proud of its imperial past, active in the international arena, and open to regional cooperation. And of course, Davutoglu did not abandon relations with Western Europe and the US, but he recognized the West as one of several equivalent vectors of Turkish foreign policy. But the problem is that the theory does not always meet practice. But although AKP diplomacy attempted to immediately increase Turkey's international influence, it soon turned out that the implementation of Ahmet Davutoglu's vision cannot be fully realized. Firstly, Turkey has failed to successfully complete its accession to the EU. Secondly, the zero problems tactic did not bring the expected results, because in the longer run, it was actually impossible to maintain relations on an equally positive level with states in conflict, like Armenia and Azerbaijan, Israel and Palestine, Serbia and Albania, and so on. So Turkish regional involvement did indeed improve the overall image of Turkey, but at the same time, the AKP government did not gain substantial strategic influence in any area of the former Ottoman Empire. And that was the main goal of Turkey after all. And we probably also remember the failure of Turkish diplomacy during the Arab Spring, right? Okay, and after a systemic change of Turkey a few years ago, it is President Erdogan who has assumed responsibility for determining directions of Turkish foreign policy. Well, the AKP diplomacy still refers to the basic rules of Davutoglu's strategic depth, but international activities of Erdogan and the current Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, are definitely more confrontational, more unpredictable, let's say. When we discuss the AKP era Turkish foreign policy towards the Balkans, we should divide it into two periods, I think. During the first one, so from 2002 to around 2011, Turkish government conducted its diplomatic activities more or less in line with European Union's expectations. The positive aspects of Turkish involvement in regional affairs included also support for deepening integration of the Balkan states with NATO. In Turkish political discourse, Turkey's intention was to ensure security and stability in the Balkans. For this reason, for example, Turkish diplomacy engaged in peace talks between former Yugoslavian states, but of course no final agreement has been reached, also because of AKP's support to the Bosnian side. Overemphasizing the Ottoman past of the region was another problematic issue, but nevertheless, Turkey's involvement in this first period in general was assessed rather positively by international community. However, after 2011, 2012, there was a shift in Turkey's international perception, which resulted from difficulties in the EU accession negotiations. Since that time, Turkish foreign policy has become more assertive and more confrontational even. In the Balkans, for example, the EU has been perceived rather as a rival to the AKP's initiatives, not like a partner as it used to be. The Western Balkans, which have limited access to the EU market, have thus become crucial for Turkey, especially in terms of economic cooperation. And another important element of Turkey's political strategy for the region is a social-cultural dimension. For obvious reasons, of course, Turkish activities in this field so far has been the most effective in contact with Muslim communities. So even if Turkish politicians declared that the initiative for regional cooperation applies to the entire Balkans, in reality, the AKP government gives priority to the Muslim majority states. And I think that it is the creation of a double image with Islam as the main variable that might be a serious limitation for Turkish foreign policy in the region. Okay, so moving on to the recent times, let's take a closer look maybe at relations between Turkey and the Western Balkan states during the pandemic. So in the last several months, Turkish government has maintained the most friendly relations with Albania. at the joint press conference in Ankara in January 2021, I think, Prime Minister Edi Rama and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced their intention to establish a strategic partnership and to tighten military cooperation between both countries. And a couple of weeks earlier, on the occasion of initiating the Turkish housing development program in Albania, Erdogan spoke about the unbreakable friendship between these nations. Okay. And Turkey's relations with Bosnia and Herzegovina has also been generally positive recently, but a key factor has been the economy. So representatives of both states focus on effective implementation of a free trade agreement in order to stimulate economic contacts after the period of pandemic stagnation. Turks, of course, also underline the importance of social and cultural relations, announcing that Turkish public diplomacy organizations would increase their activities in the region. And according to President Erdogan, the fundamental mission of his cabinet is to provide comprehensive support to all citizens in Bosnia. And among the Muslim majority states in the Western Balkans, Kosovo had the least positive relationship with Turkey during the pandemic, although an agreement on military cooperation was concluded at the beginning of 2020 and a plan to strengthen economic ties was announced. There were two issues that negatively affected mutual relations. First was the rights of a Turkish minority in Kosovo, and the second one, establishment of diplomatic relations between Kosovo and Israel. But on the other hand, Turkey's relations with the other three Western Balkan states were clearly less intense. During diplomatic visits to Montenegro, to Serbia, and to North Macedonia, AKP politicians often focus on the problems of the Muslim community. So again, we can see the religious dimension of the Turkish foreign policy, and at the same time, the necessity to enhance economic and military cooperation was strongly emphasized. And additional important element of Turkey's political strategy towards the Balkans during the pandemic has been the donation of medical equipment. The program was coordinated by Turkish Red Crescent and the Ministry of Health of Republic of Turkey, and the whole initiative was convened by President Erdogan, who highlighted Turkish commitment to provide humanitarian aid in the times of crisis. Turkey's so-called COVID diplomacy definitely improved Turkey's image in the region, and the authorities in each 6 states of the Western Balkans received Turkish involvement very positively. Okay, so the general conclusion is that the activities of the AKP government towards the Western Balkans have contributed to improving the overall image of Turkey in the region, but the authorities in Ankara still lacks necessary tools to ensure a lasting political influence. Developments of recent months clearly show that the Western Balkan states are interested in enhancing economic relations with Turkey, and to some extent also in military cooperation, while the socio-cultural dimension, which once was extremely important for Turks, is basically limited only to close contact with Muslim communities. And despite Turkey's call for development of, let's say, multi-level strategic cooperation in the face of pandemic crisis, local governments have been preoccupied with economic issues. So, in response to these expectations, Erdogan's cabinet slightly changed its approach, focusing more on the economy and regional security. So, it's more pragmatic and less ideological approach. I think that having learned from their experience so far, Turks are now aware that the religious and cultural community can be built only with Balkan Muslims who understand the values conveyed by the AKP. As for Turkish COVID diplomacy, it had certainly a positive impact on the image of Turkey in the all Balkan states, but Turkey must develop a new ways of regional engagement that would be attractive to Western Balkans after the pandemic. And it seems to me that the cooperation in security and defense is a reasonable proposal in this context. And just briefly, however, the implementation of the main goal of Turkish diplomacy in the Western Balkans, that is to gain permanent political influence in the region, it's still far from being achieved. The Western Balkans have given priority to integration with the European Union, so only a serious internal crisis in the EU can create a chance for Turkey to improve its political position in the region. my prediction would be that Turkey does not have a great prospect for gaining a dominant political role in the Western Balkans in the foreseeable future, because domestic issues are a big problem for Turkey foreign policy, namely the economic crisis and Erdogan's authoritarian turn. And the main challenge for Turkey would be the ability to conduct consistent and comprehensive diplomatic activities towards the Western Balkans in a post-pandemic reality. And I think it's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, very much. Let's just go quickly on, because we're excited about talking about the future. We've talked about the past a lot, but let's talk about the future. We have a paper, a policy paper from Konstantinos and Marija, who will look how to fix things. So I'm very looking forward to that.
Hello, everyone. From me, I hope you can hear me. My name is Konstantinos Achilles Kanellopoulos. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Manchester. In this paper that I'm presenting today, I co-authored it with Marija Loncarevic from Manchester Metropolitan University, and we are collaborating together with Marija to open a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence under the auspices of the American University of Athens. So the presentation that we're focusing here today is about reinvigorating the EU's enlargement strategy with a specific focus on the Western Balkans. However, this general, the concept of devising a new methodology for the enlargement process can be applied to the other countries that have been stuck with their accession process. So we extrapolate three distinct policy options. One is the status quo, the second one is the Macron option, and the third one is what Marija and I are proposing here today. So we are expanding on the proposals and policy papers that have been put forward by Milica Delevic and Tena Pelic from the European Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the policy paper that was written by Peter Mirel, who served as Director General of EU enlargement from the Commission. So we sketch out a novel approach for revitalizing the EU enlargement strategy. And our core argument is that by recalibrating the enlargement process in a sector by sector basis, you will see this in a little bit, the EU will be able to blur the sharp and painful divide between full membership and non-membership, which we think needs to be addressed. So first and foremost, over the past decade, the European Union has experienced a series of profound challenges and perpetual state of crisis, which has arguably led to an existential crisis, starting from the Greek crisis that's closer to home, so to speak. Then subsequently, the crisis in Crimea in 2014, the rise of Euroscepticism, Brexit, now the pandemic, and you could arguably say the issue of democratic backsliding, not to omit the migration crisis. So 2020 marked the first year that actually the European Union was actually shrinking rather than expanding. And this is a moment for us that the EU needs to go through some self-reflection and self-examination and self-introspection. So generally, from the Big Bang of the 2000s, the EU has been said to be suffering from an enlargement fatigue, and that was explicitly stated in the Economist newspaper. So for the past 20 years, the EU has sought to fundamentally shape the governance and legal framework of the Western Balkans. Now I'm sharing with you the first option, which is the status quo. The core framework for actually guiding bilateral relations between the Western Balkans and the European Union was the stabilization and accession process, which was formulated at the Cologne EU Council in 1999. And it focuses on contractual relations, financial aid, political dialogue, etc. The EU explicitly stated its commitment that the Western Balkans' future is within the European Union at the 2003 Thessaloniki agenda, when Greece was holding the rotating EU presidency. And of course, there was an element of you scratch my back, I scratch yours. But basically, the Thessaloniki agenda baptized that the member states, the Western Balkans, their future belongs to the EU. The last EU enlargement took place in 2013 when Croatia was admitted to the European Union. And then when the Juncker Commission took office, it kind of came to a surprise to everyone. And when he stated that there would be no new enlargement during his commission. At the same time, during the Juncker Commission, there have been numerous programs such as the Instrument for Pre-Accession Accession, the IPA, which has reached 3.2 billion. But at the same time, the decision by the Juncker Commission to actually freeze enlargement had detrimental repercussions for the process. During the Juncker Commission, Serbia and Montenegro were officially recognized as candidate countries and started their negotiations. But even though the Juncker Commission gave the green light in 2018, Johannes Hahn was the commissioner at the time, Austrian national. However, a series of vetoes have been imposed by a series of countries. First, it was the French non, then it was another series of countries, including by Greece before. So what has happened, although the Commission, since the Barroso Commission, there has been a green light to launch negotiations with North Macedonia in 2005, 2018, we had a critical juncture because of the Prespa agreement. And the Juncker Commission did the same for Albania. The pros and the cons of the contemporaries of the status quo is that there are problems of two-level governance, right? It takes two to tango. There hasn't been sufficient progress by the Western Balkans. That's the fact of the matter. There is a reluctance and an ambivalence by EU electorates about enlarging the bloc, and we have seen some public opinion. We see that in numerous public opinion surveys. And also, it was recently pointed out by Macron that the Western Balkan six, these are the 6 countries we're talking about: Kosovo, Albania, North Macedonia, Serbia, and of course, so the WB6 have failed to make adequate progress. Well, the negative side of the status quo is that by postponing the decision, this has created, Judy Dempsey from Carnegie said this, that European enlargement is frozen and the EU is at sea. So this caused a lot of turmoil in the domestic settings of Tirana and Skopje and undermined the EU's credibility. And this has given the chance for other actors, revisionist powers, such as Russia and Turkey, and I think that's where the other presentations touched on, but also China with the One Belt, One Road initiative. They have gained increasing influence in the front yard of the EU. In 2009, in November, this is the second option. The French presented a non-paper, and basically Macron presents an innovative approach for engaging with the current negotiation framework and replacing the acquis with a 7-stage process. And basically, the core argument that the French side made that perhaps we should make that enlargement negotiations should be reversible. In that sense, the irreversible reversibility, making it possible that even if progress is made, that we can backtrack on it. And the French side highlighted that the full and complete accession goal of complete accession would not be undermined. The pros of the French proposal are, on the one hand, that the fact of the matter is that the current state EU enlargement is not properly functioning. It offers a simple but powerful trade-off. Endless delays associated with enlargement, both by the Commission and the member states. Like I mentioned earlier, the Prespa agreement marked a paradigm shift for, revitalizing the momentum of enlargement, and the decision basically to block the Western Balkans to actually reinvigorate the process was driven by political decisions in mind and with domestic electorates. But Macron is also highlighting, and that's very close to what the academics are writing about, such as Schimmelfenning and Sedlmayr and Dimitrova, that the EU needs to pay more attention on its democratic deficit and its internal problems. The problems of the French proposition is that it's sending a lot of contradictory messages. The other problem is also, thank you, Antonio, is that it was perceived as a historic mistake. And we see that by Valerie Hopkins' article, the editorial board of the Financial Times, etc. And we see that also in comments by Western Balkan leaders such as Edi Rama of Albania, as well as Vučić in Serbia. So moving to our proposition, the problem is that the EU needs to formulate, it appears to be the case that the EU needs to put forward a new framework and address the rise of the influence of Russia, Turkey, and China in the Western Balkans, which would become a lose-lose situation. The EU is already an active stakeholder, and it is already an active stakeholder and path dependent with the future of the Balkans. So perhaps the Balkans are the ultimate litmus test for the EU as a normative power, which is something we have all touched upon in one way or another in these presentations. So what we propose here with Marija is that that the accession framework, we see that it resembles a vertical framework, and because it's too vertical, i.e. it places too much emphasis on sticks rather than carrots, we need to complement it with an horizontal approach. So in that sense, candidates that are still in full membership will be able to participate in areas of the EU. So whenever they complete a chapter of the EU acquis, they'll be able to have de facto membership in the EU policy umbrella. So essentially, when we look at the 35 chapters of EU enlargement, in that case, for instance, if a Western Balkan country successfully completed negotiations on the chapter related to energy, which is chapter 15, then they should be eligible to enter the energy union. If they concluded the negotiations on industry, they should be able to enter the industrial policy within the EU, and so on and so forth. So this way that this will allow the EU to kind of escape from the state of disarray that we currently finds itself with the Balkans, and recalibrate the methodology on a sector-by-sector basis. Thank you, Antonio. I'm wrapping up. And this way, the allocation of the progress will be linked to the progress that each state makes. That's our core proposition. And in that sense, supplementing the sticks with carrots, creating IPA2, giving the opportunity for transportation, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to go into much in these details, and I'll just conclude there so we can switch to the Q&A, and I'll be very happy to address, or myself or Marija, to address your questions. So that's it from us.
Thank you very much.